Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another hour of Healthy Conclusions, where we try to give our listeners important information on nutrition, exercise, and holistic, alternative, and integrative medicine. Please take a minute to visit our website at www.healthyconclusions.com and like us on Facebook. My name is Bob Neugebauer, and I will be your host for this evening's show. Tonight's show is being brought to you by Altrua Health Share, which has been serving its members and their families with their health care needs since 1997. Please take a moment to visit their website at altruahealthshare.org or call 888-244-3839 to see just what Altrua Health Share can offer you and your family for their health care needs. It could mean substantial savings. Tonight we have two special guests here. One is an attorney and the other is a doctor. So we're going to talk about cannabis and the pros and cons, both medically and legally. Our first guest is Dr. Michael Karlfeldt, who runs a large integrative medical clinic here in Idaho at Meridian. Dr. Karlfeldt is a board-certified traditional naturopath with 20 years of clinical experience and offices previously in Los Angeles and Stockholm. He has been practicing in Boise, Idaho since 1999. Our second guest is John Green. He is a constitutional lawyer who currently serves as general counsel and chief law enforcement advisor to the United States Bill of Rights Foundation. John earned a Bachelor of Science degree in criminal justice with honors from the University of Houston and a Doctor of Jurisprudence from South Texas College of Law. He is an experienced trial lawyer who concentrates on matters related to liberty, including but not limited to healthcare freedom and school choice. He also has 41 years of relevant criminal justice experience. So, gentlemen, I'd like to start off here with a few words about this subject matter. As I'm sure you are aware, that we are currently having a pending session in the legislature that will hear a bill on February 15th on whether the state of Idaho will make it legal to use CBD oil for medicinal purposes. This is similar to the legislation passed in the last session, yet it was vetoed by the governor. I'd like to set the tone of this conversation by giving a brief history of cannabis and its use in the United States. Up until 1937, cannabis was a medicine obtainable over the counter at just about any pharmacy. And we know that there were, at one time, over 2,000 medicines using cannabis and over 280 manufacturers of these medicines. In fact, three of our largest drug companies, Lilly, Upjohn, and Parke-Davis, produced about 100 different medicines from cannabis that were used to treat epilepsy, addiction, cancer, and a multitude of other illnesses. It was because of two greedy corporations, the Hearst Company and DuPont, that used their political clout to have a relative of Andrew Mellon, a large DuPont financier, appointed to the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs under the administration of Herbert Hoover. Once in office, he declared hemp dangerous, and the federal government began a propaganda campaign led by what we would today call fake news media of Randolph Hearst's media cartel. And so the word marijuana, a.k.a. hemp, was born along with the horrifying stories on how it was responsible for auto accidents, acts of violence, incurable insanity, and vicious murders. They also produced movies like Reefer Madness and Marijuana, The Devils of Weed. They were run at the movie houses, and hemp, a.k.a. marijuana, was put on the U.S. Schedule I list as a dangerous drug. So I'm going to start off with you, Mr. Green, and ask you if the history I just gave you is correct. Why hasn't this, shall we call it, mistake in identity of making marijuana, a.k.a. cannabis, a Schedule I drug, been noticed for what it is in the horrible miscarriage of justice and been rectified?
Well, I think your history is pretty accurate. One component that people often leave out is the powers that be that are against either hemp or marijuana production. Actually, because they're two separate things, they were considered differently. Randolph Hearst and his cabal had a different interest in having hemp production stopped as opposed to the big pharma. Hearst didn't want hemp paper competing with his forestry holdings and paper pulp, which made him obviously a very wealthy man. And so that's part of the problem. We have these big competing interests with the legitimate uses for both cannabis, either hemp marijuana or hemp. Now, as far as why it hasn't been rectified, there's a Latin term, cui bono, which means who profits, who benefits. So that's really what we have to consider when we're looking at both marijuana and hemp. What interests benefit financially by keeping marijuana and hemp products out of the hands of citizens? And I think when you look at the history of how both of these plants became, or this one plant, which has two different types, how it became illegal, I think very clearly you can see who benefits. And that was summed up in your recitation of the history of the anti-marijuana. Reefer Madness, if people haven't seen it, I saw it when I was in high school in the 70s, and basically at that time we laughed at it. But when you look back at the history of it, when it was first in concept and then developed, it was intended to be an anti-marijuana, which led to anti-hemp propaganda film. And so there's a lot of competing forces, which is the reason why this has not been rectified yet. Good news is people are waking up now, and I think things are changing.
We know that in 1974, the National Institute of Health shut down studies at the Medical College of Virginia, which had discovered the remarkable effectiveness of THC in cannabis in treating 3 different kinds of cancer: lung, breast, and viral leukemia, and also shrinking tumors and reducing pain without causing addiction. Why hasn't there ever been a lawsuit against the government for suppressing this information that could be of critical value in saving the lives of countless American citizens?
Well, as a legal matter, it's very hard to sue any government for anything. We have this concept called sovereign immunity, and basically the concept evolves from the theory that because government is we the people in the United States, that we would be suing ourselves. So it's kind of a silly notion, really, when you think about it, because obviously the government is made up of individual people, all of whom might have some culpability or liability under certain circumstances. But as a practical matter, it's just too expensive for most people to prosecute any kind of litigation against any government entity. Never mind the federal government, who has basically endless supplies of funding because they control a theoretical printing press.
Dr. Karlfeldt, cannabis has a multitude of uses in the medical world, and we are just starting to scratch the surface of its many medicinal compounds and their applications. Could you give us a flavor for the many current uses of cannabis and cannabidiol? And tell us what is the difference between the THC psychoactive and the anti-psychoactive cannabinoid CBD oil?
Yeah, so when you look at cannabis, another name that we're used to is marijuana, most of the time we think then of the psychoactive effect of that you get when you're using it. And from those movies that you mentioned, you see how people, that psychoactive impact, and people are scared of that and think that this can't be anything that is good. But what you forget is that the cannabis actually have about 500 different chemical components, and 100, actually found, I think 113 of them are what's called cannabinoids, which all have an impact on your physiological system, and they all can be extremely beneficial. And it's only pretty much the THC component, which is one of the cannabinoids, that has that psychoactive impact on the brain, and that has to do with what kind of receptors that they lock into in the brain and the central nervous system. But you also have then another component that's called CBD, which is another cannabinoid that exists quite a bit in the cannabis, and and that one have a tremendous amount of health benefits. They've seen receptor sites on the immune system cells. They've seen it in liver, lungs, central nervous system. So they've seen that it's directly connected to a system that naturally exists within the body that regulates how pretty much all our organs function. It comes to pain signaling, blood pressure, appetite, digestion, even bone density, and how we metabolize fat and then break down fat, and how we feel emotionally. And it actually has a very brain protective quality, the CBD aspect. So you can then cultivate the cannabis in a way so that it can be pretty much no THC, so none of the psychoactive components, but then you get all these tremendous amount of benefits that then plug into a system that naturally exists within the body anyway.
I'd like to take a quick break. We'll be back in a few minutes. You're listening to Healthy Conclusions, brought to you by Altrua Health Share with your host Bob Neugebauer on 580 KIDO AM and 107.5 FM. Welcome back to Health Conclusions on 580 KIDO. We're speaking with Dr. Michael Karlfeldt and attorney John Green, and our conversation tonight is about cannabis, the pros and cons legally and medically. So, Dr. Karlfeldt, we were talking about cannabis and the two different types of psychoactive and non-psychoactive cannabinoid. Can you tell us what these two are used for? Because as I understand it, they're both used differently for different diseases.
Yeah, I see a large variety of patients in my practice, and a lot of them are dealing with quite severe health conditions, dealing with cancer, autoimmune disorders like MS, Lyme disease, severe neurological, Parkinson's, ALS, and so forth. And when it comes then with, especially then the CBD, since it does not have the psychoactive impact, people really communicate about the benefit it has in regulating the inflammation, reducing inflammation, and also then supporting the nervous system. So, for instance, dealing with MS, you have then the inflammation along the myelin sheath, where the myelin sheath is then starting to degrade and it's being attacked by the immune system. And they've seen that the CBD actually modulates the immune system and slows down that attack. So, which means that it can be useful in any kind of autoimmune disorder, not just MS, but Crohn's, colitis, rheumatoid arthritis, all the different autoimmunes that are becoming more and more prevalent nowadays. So regulating the immune system, but then also it works with the pain signaling system so that the body does not get stuck in this. When you have a pain signal, it is because something is wrong in the body. And even though sometimes you fix what is wrong in the body still sends that pain signal. And the CBD then helps, the cannabinoid helps them to shut down that pain signal and let the body know that things are okay. You don't need to be in that fight or flight or hyper alert state. So it helps to calm down the pain signal, modulate the immune system, reduce inflammation, and that's just in that category. Then you have the category of cancer, where they've actually seen that the cannabinoids help to reduce the likelihood of cancer to spread, to replicate, also increase this immune system's ability to actually attack the cancer. So there's been a lot of people that has used these different cannabinoids very successfully while they've been struggling with their own cancer. And then also, of course, in dealing with some of the effects of the normal chemotherapy that a lot of cancer patients then obviously undergo, like the cachexia, the muscle wasting, or dealing with the nausea or vomiting or neurological pain. All of these symptoms or effects of chemo the cannabinoids have been very, very effective in dealing with it, much more so than any other medication.
Are any of the oncologists using the cannabinoids in that way with the chemo as a separate structure to help patients, or is this something that's kind of taboo within their category of oncology?
It is something that, since it is not standard of care, a medical oncologist would get into a severe problem if they would start to prescribe or suggest these type of medications.
So if you're trying to help somebody get rid of their pain and make them feel better, it's illegal. But if you want to kill them, that's okay.
Yes, as long as it is according to the rule book of the standard of care, according to medical practices, then you can keep your license. But if you deviate from that, even if research is showing that there is something that could be beneficial, you put yourself in a position where you may lose your license and have legal implications.
And we wonder why our medical system is so screwed up. Well, you've just answered part of that question.
Yeah.
Mr. Green, you know that CBD and THC are both effective in treating different diseases. Why couldn't a person who lives in a state bring a lawsuit against that state, or for that matter, the federal government, for withholding the life-saving medicine? Or is that just too much of a stretch? And again, we're going to come back to, can you sue the state? Can you sue the federal government? There has to be some way to get into these people to let them understand they can't continue to outlaw medicines that actually work.
Well, I think again, as a practical matter, as I stated, the sovereign immunity issue, and then the practical matter of cost of litigation against the government, any government, is prohibitive. But as on the other side of the coin, I think right now, especially, this is really coming to the forefront because states are beginning to flex their 10th Amendment muscles, for lack of a better term, and telling the federal government, this is not something that you're properly empowered to regulate. We're going to take control of this. And so now, just for practical purposes and as a legal matter, I always, when I'm discussing this with people, try to separate the CBD in the non-THC form as opposed to the THC, because it's a little harder issue when we talk about the THC. But for right now, the people that virtually all the people that I know that are using CBD are using the hemp version, which has a trace amounts of CBD. And in the Ninth Circuit, which includes Idaho, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has already held that for these naturally occurring trace amounts of THC, it's beyond the scope of the federal government to regulate that. DEA doesn't have the authority to come in and say THC is illegal. So we already have a remedy in place. The problem is people don't know that. And if you read the cases, the two in particular called Hemp 1 and Hemp 2, which were hemp importers and producers that were making products, consumables or comestibles, they call them, things that you're going to eat in the U.S., the DEA tried to prevent them from doing so, and twice now the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has struck them down because cannot regulate hemp if it's legally imported into the United States, and there are plenty of companies importing hemp products into the United States. As an example, Costco. I buy hemp seeds at Costco. Obviously, they're sterilized, but if I were to take those and press them down into an oil, I could take CBD oil from that, and certainly, at least in a trace amount, there might be some THC in there. But again, that's beyond the regulatory scope of the federal government. So the states now are wising up and telling the federal government, you are not going to control what our citizens eat or how they treat themselves with medicine. That's not the federal government's responsibility, and they have no authority to do so.
Or in the case of Idaho, they are telling us that we cannot use CBD oil and that it is against the law. However, federally, they have lost these lawsuits. And I was told by a legislator just the other day that we cannot bring the CBD in here legally because our attorney general would come out against it and fight it in court. So how do you deal with something like that?
Well, again, it's a matter of education. Now, just as an aside, this is one of the issues that I've been pushing for many years is this notion that our state legislature needs their own lawyer. The legal counsel for the Attorney General's office does not represent the interests of the legislature, who are the people's representatives. We have a citizen legislature. They represent us. The Attorney General's office represents the executive branch, and so there's a conflict. If the legislature had their own lawyer and did the same research that I did, certainly their conclusion would be it most certainly is legal for Idahoans to use, currently under current federal law, to use hemp products that are legally imported as long as they meet their standard with regard to THC, meaning just a trace. Hemp, by its nature, only has trace amounts of THC. I know maybe Dr. Karfeld could do the math, but if it takes something, most states have limits on THC content for edibles where marijuana is legal, and I think a dose probably would be somewhere between 5 milligrams and 10 milligrams of THC. Maybe Dr. Karfeld could tell us how much CBD oil you'd have to drink at 0.03% THC to get an intoxicating dose of THC. I mean, it's probably more than a human could consume. And I certainly wouldn't want to have to suffer the effects intestinally of what would happen if I drank half a gallon or more of CBD oil.
We're going to have to take a quick break. We'll be back in a few minutes. You're listening to Health Conclusions, brought to you by Altrua Health Share, with your host Bob Neugebauer on 580 KIDO AM and 107.5 FM. Welcome back to Health Conclusions on 580 KIDO. We're speaking with Dr. Michael Karlfeldt and Attorney John Green. Our subject matter is cannabis pros and cons, medically and legally. So, Dr. Karlfeldt, could you explain the benefits and efficacy of cannabis in treating many of the illnesses without the side effects that are currently treated with pharmaceuticals? And could you give us an idea of the relative cost difference in the cannabis as opposed to the synthetic pharmaceutical products, say for the treatment of some of the autoimmune diseases like MS and Parkinson?
So, a good example, I would say, would be a patient. Actually, no, this was not a patient. This was a lady that I interviewed for a TV show that I had a number of years ago. She'd been dealing with MS, and she was drugged out completely just so that she was not in pain and so that she was able to function in some fashion, taking bunches of opioids and she could barely be a mother to her children. So she lived a pretty horrible life. It cost obviously the medical system a lot of money to supply all this medication. She was not really a productive citizen, so it cost society in that way. And she wasn't really able to be a mother, so it cost her personally and cost her family not being able to have a mother. So she took a trip. There was an event that was taking place in Washington where the cannabis was legal, and somebody offered her cannabis, and she was able to, just right after, her pain went away. She became clear-headed, able to focus, able to move around. The nervous system started to function properly. She was able to dance, enjoy life, and so she was able to become a mother again. So obviously, for her, she brought that then back into Idaho, even though it was illegal, still illegal here. But she brought it back into here to use because she felt that the benefit outweighed the risk, so to say. So she functioned great. Was a wonderful mother, and then somebody found out that she was using cannabis, and they found it, and they came in and took her children away, and obviously she had to get back onto opioids, and she went back to where she was before. So it is the benefits of the cannabis is that it is less. It has a less detrimental impact on the body in so many different ways, and it's much safer than a lot of the different opioids that we use. And so I feel that with the opioid crisis that we're dealing with, this is something to really look at as a solution. I know a lot of people are scared then about the psychoactive impact of THC. So in order to eliminate that fear, then why not just use the CBD that has a lot of the different beneficial aspect as well as the THC does, and then utilize the benefits from that, to fight things like MS, Parkinson's, cancer, autoimmune disorders, but also things like depression, anxiety, which is becoming actually one of the leading reasons people are going to ER and seeking medical care. Is because of these emotional issues that people are dealing with, because they've seen that CBD has an impact to actually reduce the inflammation in the brain and regulate neurotransmitters, which then drives how we feel and how we think. So I truly feel that the solution is to look at this much, much more closely than we currently are.
Mr. Green, what is curious to me is that the DEA classifies cannabis as a Schedule I drug defined as having no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. If that's the case, why was it sold in multiple formats by three of the largest drug companies up until 1937 over the counter? And why would the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services hold a patent titled Cannabinoids and Antioxidants and Neuroprotectants, which claims that non-psychoactive cannabinoids, such as cannabidiol, are particularly advantageous to use because of their non-toxic effects? This seems to be very contradictory.
Well, I think it is, and we go back to the term I used earlier, cui bono, who benefits, who profits. So in 1937, we had the Marijuana Tax Act was in effect, and basically the government's position was then, well, this stuff's being used and sold in the United States, let's put an excise tax on it and make money on it. So you had all these doctors and drug companies that were involved in marketing and use of these products that were paying a tax to the federal government. Which would an excise tax, which would have been in line with the Congress's constitutional authority to tax. In 1970, the Marijuana Tax Act was abandoned in favor of the Controlled Substances Act. And the Controlled Substances Act, when you look at the types of substances that are put on that list to be controlled, the thing that they mostly all have in common are they're all economically beneficial to somebody. That's been one of the complaints. We have people complaining now about this opioid crisis, but yet we have the United States federal government in Afghanistan protecting the poppy field growers, which are contributing to the illegal flow of opioids into the United States. So it's not so much about, if we could eradicate those sources, those external sources of those very harmful substances, and opioid addiction is a serious problem. But somebody's making lots of money, and the same thing applies to controlling the marijuana. I don't think it's the business of the federal government to hold patents for anything. I don't think that's a constitutionally authorized power of the federal government. And then as far as distinguishing between the psychoactive and the the non-psychoactive forms of CBD, again, part of it's originally back to the protection of a particular economic interest. We're talking about the hemp and how much it would benefit people, but yet how much it would harm the interests of people and businesses that have competing products. And so it's not a matter of whether it makes sense. There is no matter of right and wrong. The health benefits are not considered at all. It's purely an economic issue as far as the federal government is concerned, and that is, how do we control the very profitable nature of these natural substances so that special interests, who's given the big campaign contributions to congressmen that are continually fighting medical freedom? That's certainly the cui bono of that equation is, look who's benefiting financially from this ridiculous situation that is affecting the health of millions of Americans negatively.
So we basically have the big pharma companies who are out there trying to negatively impact any use of cannabinoids. And, it's amazing to me that they don't have anybody's interest but their own at heart. But here is a industry that spends $5 billion a year on advertising drugs that are killing people every day of the year. We lost 60,000 people last year just in terms of opioids. And we're going to lose a lot more this year because nothing seems to have changed. And the ridiculous part of this is the fact that the opioids need to be disbanded and pushed to the side when you have a drug like cannabidiol or even something with THC in it. It has been known to be more effective in relieving pain. And this is from the patients that are using it that we're hearing this. And it has very little, if any, long-term effects or side effects in terms of becoming addicted. So my question is, we have a war on opioids going on that our president has said we have. So Dr. Karlfeldt, why would we even think about not allowing this particular substance to be used in the state legally?
Yes, something that always fascinates me is that you have the medical doctors, their oath that they take, first do no harm. So here you have then a substance that have more benefits and less negative effects. It's less detrimental on the body. And that is what's being illegal. But then you can pump these patients with as much opioids as they can possibly handle, and that is legal. So that is something that just fascinates me. I understand that there's a concern in regards to the THC component, but the THC is still less addictive than tobacco, than alcohol, and obviously much less addictive than opioids. So it's much easier for an individual to withdraw from it. So to have the availability when you need it to take care of the issue, in addition to then all the benefits that it has. It's been used to treat things like glaucoma and the epileptic seizures. Both the THC and CBD. So here you have all these children that are dealing and adults dealing with epileptic seizures, and they put them on these harmful seizure medication that have long-term health effects on these people. And instead of using something that can be anti-inflammatory, neuroprotective, so protecting the nerve, and then reduce these seizure activities, that actually has a healing effect.
We're going to have to take a quick break here, Doctor. We'll be back in a few minutes. You're listening to Health Conclusions, brought to you by Altrua Health Share, with your host, Bob Neugebauer, on 580 KIDO AM and 107.5 FM. Welcome back to Health Conclusions on 580 KIDU. We're speaking with Dr. Michael Karlfeldt and attorney John Green. Our conversation is on cannabis pros and cons, medically and legally. So, gentlemen, just kind of something that I ran across, which was interesting. This is one that either one of you can talk about. The Department of Health and Human Services found that about $165 million was saved in 17 medical marijuana states in 2013 alone. And it is estimated that the annual Medicare prescription savings to the U.S. government would be over $500 million if all 50 states would implement similar programs. So why do you think the states like Idaho, that has just passed a $100 million legislation bill to pay for Medicaid expansion, wouldn't be gung-ho in bringing medical cannabis into the forefront of treatment? Why do they treat this with such disdain? And is it because of the lobbying efforts of the representatives of Big Pharma, or do you think they just don't have the education to understand its benefits because of a lack of information? Well,
I think you hit the nail on the head there, that they just don't have the information. there's cognitive dissonance has set in terribly with regard to this issue. And as Dr. Karfeld was talking a few minutes ago and explaining in very good detail why CBD is good medicine and the positive effects that it can have on a person's health. In Idaho, when I talk to some legislators, not just the legislators, but to the public in general, we have this, to go back to the movie Reefer Madness, we have this Reefer Madness mentality that when they hear the word cannabis, they think, oh my goodness, stoned teenagers going across the state creating mayhem and havoc. And so it is a matter of education that people should know what the cannabis plant is. People should know it has different components, and depending on how it's treated, can have, intoxicating psychoactive effects, or in another form it has none, but still has health benefits. And once we can get them to separate the two, then it's up to the health practitioners like Dr. Karfeld to show people why this is good medicine. And the state of Idaho in particular, our legislators should not be afraid to say, let's consider this for the benefit of Idahoans. This is good medicine. It's got legitimate purposes, and it will save us money in the long run, which should be their concern with almost everything they're voting on.
Dr. Karfeld, when it comes to education, can you explain how cannabis works through the receptors of the endocannabinoid system in our bodies, and why they haven't taught doctors or nurses about this system during their medical educations, except for very few in the past 10 years?
Yeah, we have a system that's called the endocannabinoid or cannabinoid system. And endo just means that it is something that's produced naturally within the body. So we actually produce cannabinoids naturally within our own bodies. And we have all these receptors all over the body, in the immune system, in the brain, liver, kidneys, bone, fatty tissue. They exist all over. In fact, there are more cannabinoid receptors in the body than there are opiate receptors. That's how important of a system that is. So these help to regulate the body's ability to deal with trauma, to deal with pain, deal with inflammation, and also helps to regulate the neurotransmitters. They support the regulation of dopamine, serotonin, acetylcholine. So they have all these regulatory aspects, and this is a natural system that exists. So what we can use, like CBD and THC and all the other hundreds of cannabinoids that exist naturally in the hemp plant, they have an impact on these different receptor sites, and they can either stimulate them, they can make the other cannabinoids that naturally exist in the body live longer and become more active. So you can support that system with the hemp plant. And like Mr. Green was talking about, what frustrates people like me is the dissonance when you're talking to legislators, and also the dissonance I feel our Attorney General has, where they lump everything into one bucket when there's so many other aspects to this picture than just, it's hemp, that's marijuana, people get stoned, and that's bad. You're dealing with 500 different chemicals in the hemp plant, and they can be cultured in so many different ways to then have pretty much non-existent THC. And in fact, if you try to measure it, you can't find it, but they've set the limit of 0.03%, even though it tends to be much less than that. So it's the understanding that these are natural substances that exist within our bodies. These are phytocannabinoids that exist within the hemp plant that work on a system that naturally exists, the cannabinoid system in the body, to regulate all the functions of our body. So they are an extremely important nutrient, like a vitamin, like a mineral, that we need. And especially when we're dealing with the stressors of today's society, we need that extra support. So finding that, finding the benefit and understanding the benefit and not being so afraid just because there's one aspect of it that is psychoactive, and knowing that there's a way to eliminate that psychoactive component and still have the benefit of everything else.
Thank you very much. Mr. Green, if you could, in your experience as an attorney, would you give us an answer to a question that I have in solving this problem? How would you present a case to the legislative body that we have that this substance has basically proved itself efficacious in treating many diseases, but is being treated like heroin and fentanyl? And shouldn't the individual have the freedom to choose what they are going to use to fight disease instead of taking whatever the pharmaceutical companies decide is the drug of the week?
Well, I think really before you can even address how to deliver this message to the legislature, you have to know where their source of information is coming from. And so when I'm discussing this with anybody, whether it's a legislature or some other person, I ask them, what's the source of your information with regard to the chemical makeup, the uses, and the effectiveness of either THC or non-THC CBD oil? And you get a lot of surprising answers. Some of them readily admit they have none. Well, those might be the easiest to deal with, because then you can take some of these studies that have been done into the uses and effectiveness of CBD and present that to them and say, have you ever considered this, or would you consider it? But I think from the fastest standpoint, as far as getting the message across, is helping them understand that the cannabis plant has different uses, and depending on how it's processed, it's either psychoactive or non-psychoactive. So for purposes of helping people improve the medical condition of their lives today, we can separate the two for purposes of our legislature and say hemp CBD is not psychoactive and it has all of these health benefits. We're not asking the legislature right now to say, let's make marijuana legal and separate the two. If you want to associate reefer madness with the cannabis plant, do it with the marijuana, but not with the hemp CBD. And I'm not suggesting anybody do that, because there's a lot of misinformation about the marijuana as well. But we're just talking about CBD now. Dr.
Karlfeldt, would you agree with that?
I absolutely agree with that. I think that's a perfect strategy. Yeah, because most of the opinions are based upon not knowing and not understanding. So it becomes our job to educate the legislators, and also our job to educate the public so that the public can educate their own legislators. I think that's a key.
Well, I'd like to thank Dr. Karlfeldt and Mr. Green for joining us this evening and for offering their insights into the pros and cons of cannabis medically and legally. And this is Bob Neugebauer saying good night for Health Conclusions, and we hope you will join us again at the same time next week for another show talking about holistic, alternative, and integrative medicine. Thank you, and have a good evening.